The Carrie Furnace in southwestern Pennsylvania are among the only surviving pre-World War II blast furnaces left on Earth. Operating for nearly a century, these structures produced the raw iron needed to supply the massive Homestead steelworks just across the river. At their peak, just these two surviving furnaces consumed millions of tons of iron ore, coke, and limestone annually, running 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Continuing these operations around the clock was not just about supply and demand, it was an operational need. The fires inside were never allowed to go out because cooling down the brick lining would cause the entire structure to potentially crack and fail. So, in that context, workers had to tap liquid iron at nearly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit directly from the bottom of the furnaces. From there, this molten metal was poured into specialized rail cars called torpedo cars, which then hauled the liquid payload across a hot metal bridge over the river while it was still molten. So, as you might imagine, working here was incredibly hazardous. For example, the production process naturally generated massive amounts of carbon monoxide, an odorless gas that regularly leaked from the pipes and could asphyxiate workers without warning. Furthermore, at the base of the furnaces, unexpected moisture entering the molten pool could cause so-called blast furnace breakouts, creating a steam explosion that hurled liquid iron directly onto crews. And the list of these dangers goes on and on. So, how did this massive industrial facility operate? What was it all for, and why did it fall apart? Stay tuned to find out as we explore the fascinating history of the Carrie Furnace. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. In many ways, our story today begins with an America that was radically changing after the Civil War. Before this era, most heavy construction relied on wrought iron or cast iron, which was brittle and prone to shattering under high stress. At the same time, steel was a luxury item produced in tiny quantities by skilled blacksmiths. But by the late 1800s, everything was changing. America entered a massive industrial boom driven by the rapid expansion of railroads. With that, the country suddenly needed hundreds of thousands of miles of track capable of handling heavier, faster trains. At the same time, high-strength structural steel was required to anchor the foundations of America's earliest skyscrapers. So it's an understatement when I say that the demand vastly outweighed the supply, leading the business magnates of the era to innovate, as they knew that whoever came up with a solution could earn a vast fortune. The breakthrough came with the Bessemer process, an engineering innovation that blasted cold air through molten iron to burn out impurities, making high-quality steel cheap and easy to mass produce for the first time in history. To get that purity, industrial centers relied on blast furnaces, a technology that dates back centuries but was pushed to its absolute mechanical limits in southwestern Pennsylvania. These structures functioned like giant chemical pressure cookers, melting iron ore by burning coke and limestone. As these processes evolved, so too did American skylines, railroads, and manufacturing, with Pittsburgh becoming the perfect epicenter for it all, as it sits directly atop a massive coal field and is surrounded by river networks that could easily transport raw materials from the northern mines. With that in mind, in 1884, a group of local investors established the Carrie Furnace Company, building the first two blast furnaces on the narrow banks of the river near Swissvale. The site was so productive that it quickly caught the eye of Andrew Carnegie, the ruthless corporate titan who was systematically buying up every stage of the supply chain to eliminate his competition. Carnegie realized that if he wanted his nearby Homestead steelworks to completely dominate global markets, he could no longer just rely on buying iron ore from third parties. He needed his own source. So in 1898, Carnegie purchased the furnace site, officially integrating it into his massive industrial empire. With Carnegie's millions backing the operation, the site was rapidly expanded. The goal was to create a hyper-efficient pipeline that could produce raw iron at volumes that the world had never seen. However, just 3 years later, in 1901, Carnegie sold his entire network to J.P. Morgan, creating U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. Under this new corporate framework, the demand on the Pittsburgh site skyrocketed. The existing infrastructure couldn't keep pace with the global hunger for American steel, creating the need for a newer, far larger, generation of blast furnaces. And it was that exact corporate pressure that led to the construction of the giants we see today, furnaces numbers 6 and 7. By 1907, the demand for American steel was growing so fast that furnaces 6 and 7 were running around the clock, which was an amazing logistical feat considering the complexity of the supply chain required to accomplish that scale. Allow me to illustrate this. To produce just 1 ton of liquid iron, the furnace had to consume 2 tons of iron ore, shipped hundreds of miles across the Great Lakes, alongside 1 ton of coke, which was a highly purified, baked coal fuel sourced from local mines. When furnaces 6 and 7 were running at maximum capacity, they were collectively devouring over 10,000 tons of raw material daily, requiring a non-stop fleet of river barges and heavy rail cars constantly unloading onto the riverbanks to keep the fires from going out. The coke burned so intensely that the ore melted down to a white-hot liquid iron. Once tapped, this liquid iron was shipped across the river to be refined into the steel plates, eventually forming the structural bones of things like skyscrapers, World War II battleships, and the cables of the Golden Gate Bridge. And so I really want to emphasize here that the modern framework of America was born, quite literally, inside these boiling iron vats. And as great as that is, it came at a heavy price to the men who worked inside. The labor conditions inside furnaces 6 and 7 were notoriously harsh. Men worked in 12-hour shifts, frequently alternating between the extreme outdoor cold and the blinding radiant heat that could reach up to 130 degrees Fahrenheit on the floor. Because safety regulations were decades away, injuries were just a routine part of the job. One of the greatest threats was carbon monoxide, an odorless, toxic byproduct of the blast process. The gas routinely leaked from massive iron pipes, completely overwhelming workers on the upper platforms before they even realized they were breathing it in. Worse still were the localized steam explosions. You see, if even a tiny pocket of moisture got trapped beneath the pool of iron liquid at the base of the furnace, the water would instantaneously flash into steam, violently throwing 3,000-degree molten metal across the casting floor. So, with conditions that dangerous, why on earth did thousands of men line up to take jobs here? The answer is actually quite simple: economic survival and mobility. Despite the immense risks, U.S. Steel paid steady wages in cash, a massive draw for the wave of Eastern and Southern European immigrants that were coming to America during these times. For many American families, mine included, this type of dangerous work was a guaranteed stepping stone into the comfortable middle class, allowing them to buy homes and build up neighborhoods. This massive influx of labor rapidly transformed Pittsburgh. The city's population skyrocketed, triggering a boom in civic infrastructure, from streetcar lines to schools and dense rows of beautiful brick houses. Yet by the mid-20th century, the world was changing. New technologies were emerging abroad, and the industrial setup that had made Pittsburgh feel like the center of the world was about to face a sudden and permanent decline. For decades, American steel had dominated because global competitors were rebuilding from the devastation of World War II. But around the 1970s, foreign mills in Europe and Japan came back to life. These new mills were equipped with highly efficient, highly automated technologies that America lacked, specifically basic oxygen steelmaking and continuous casting. In contrast, Pennsylvania's older infrastructure was outdated. At the Carrie Furnaces, crews were forced to patch up the aging brick linings and weld cracked piping that should have been completely replaced. Perhaps worst of all, operating Carrie's massive manual blast furnaces required huge amounts of expensive labor and energy. So, as the place began to fall apart, rumors of layoffs and consolidations began to circulate. The facility could just no longer compete with the cheaper, higher quality foreign imports that were flooding the market. And so it was. In 1978, blast furnaces number 6 and 7 were decommissioned. Some aspects of the site limped along for a few more years until 1982, when all iron production at the Carrie blast furnace plant was phased out completely. 4 years later, the flagship Homestead Steelworks across the river also closed its gates, ending over a century of industrial tradition. The consequences to this were stark. Nearby towns, which had spent generations entirely dependent on the mill's payroll, were plunged into economic depression. And so tens of thousands of blue-collar families simply packed up and left in search of a better life. And so, as the population departed between 82 and the late 90s, the Carrie plant was plunged into what we could best describe as systematic pillaging. After US Steel walked away, they sold the 160-acre property to the Park Corporation in 1988. Rather than preservation, the new owners chose liquidation. This is when 2 of the 4 remaining blast furnaces were completely cut apart for scrap metal, and a wrecking ball took down large swaths of the surrounding brick and iron support buildings. By the mid-1990s, salvage crews moved out, leaving furnaces 6 and 7 behind, just because their massive size made them too difficult and expensive to demolish. Left entirely unmonitored by then, and surrounded by little more than rusting railroad tracks, the site became something of an industrial graveyard. And just as the valley was reaching its absolute lowest point, the forgotten ruins of these furnaces would end up taking an unexpected turn. In 1997, a collective of local artists began to break into the abandoned site over several months. Working secretly and illegally, they salvaged pipes, wire mesh, and industrial hoses found throughout the grounds to construct a massive 40-foot tall sculpture directly between the decaying structures. Known as the Carrie Deer, these striking pieces of illegal artwork became an underground symbol of resilience, and they fundamentally changed public perception of the ruins. This artwork helped locals understand that the eyesore of an abandoned blast furnace was also their heritage. Recognizing the historical value of the site, preservationists stepped in. In 2006, the remaining structures were officially designated as National Historic Landmarks, permanently saving furnaces 6 and 7 from demolition. And today, the entire facility is managed in a state of arrested decay. And so that's the story of the Carrie Blast Furnace. I really hope you guys enjoyed the episode, and will consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss what we do next. Otherwise, as always, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.